suggest a moratorium.
They suggested what?
A moratorium to stop all
the
AI
moratorium
development.
cannot work. It's insane. In my entire life, and I'm old, in my entire life, I have seen a technological moratorium work one time. They point to the moratorium petitions after the atom bomb that were circulated by Leo Szilard, and that were derided as useless by Edward Teller, two of the great Jewish physicists, along with Richard Feynman and others who helped make the bomb. And Teller laughed and he said, this is never going to work, and it didn't.
This was a snippet for today's conversation with our guest speaker, David Brin. We discussed the risk of AI and ways to reduce those risks. And now, for the entire conversation. Hey, thank you for joining us. Today we have a special guest, David Brin, a science fiction author and a PhD in astronomy, a NASA consultant. He is best known by one Hugo and Aurora. Postman was adapted to a film in 1997 with Kevin Costner. Today we're going to talk about AI and the risk of AI and how to mitigate these risks. So welcome, David.
Nice of you to have me, Ron, and greetings to your audience, which might include, at this point, various types of AI. If not live, then tuning into the online version a month later, a year later, several years later. The first to tune in will, of course, be these large language models, which will use this recording, possibly live right now, as part of their training sets. For learning to mimic sapience. I prefer the word sapience over the misused word sentience. But even though these golems, because they are generative large language models, which I'm surprised nobody has pointed out, comes across as golem, even though it is mathematically extremely unlikely that any of them have consciousness or self-awareness yet, they will mimic self-awareness. They already are, because that's what they're programmed to do. And they're going to fool people, which means that the Turing test, which was established by Turing back in 1948 or so, when he said that we'll know that artificial synthetic cyber beings are real when they can fool human beings who are in another room, dealing with them only by words. Well, millions of people are already being fooled by these golems, by these large language models. I have yet to ever see a case in which one has fooled me. But I expect to be fooled by December. They are getting better that fast.
How close do you think we are to AGI?
Well, AGI is a different thing. Actual intelligent beings that have a sense of self and consciousness and all of that, there is no possible way that these large language models actually qualify, because they operate on the basis of iterative adding of words. They add words to a growing response to your prompt. Then they put that somewhat longer sentence back into the language model and add another word, and then add another word, checking it against their training set in their language model. That's not how a sapient mind works. It's not thinking. What it is that artificial intelligence is developing its peripheral abilities first, so that when actual synthetic intelligence does occur, it will all instantly be able to speak to us using these language models. So what's happened is the larynx and the voice and the speech centers are happening before the frontal lobes or the conscious cortex. So when a conscious cortex does appear, and these are metaphors, parallels, it won't be exactly the same as us, it will instantly be able to speak. Just as the robotic bodies, their reflexes, their ability to act physically has been developed for several years by Boston Dynamics and other robotic companies. You've all seen the videos of these fantastic acrobatic robots. So the peripherals are being done first. I don't actually believe, although I could be wrong about this, I don't believe that the large language models, these golems, will be the path that achieves actual sapience. 6 years ago, I gave a keynote at World of Watson, which is the annual meeting of those who try to do another path to artificial intelligence, and that's the algorithmic fact and calculation approach that everybody thought would get us to AI. I still believe it's more likely to result in actual consciousness. But 6 years ago, I gave a talk at World of Watson, and I predicted that in 5 years, whether or not we have AI, actual sapience, we will suffer the world's first robotic empathy crisis. And it happened exactly 5 years later to the month. A year ago, 5 years after I made the prediction, a fellow at Google announced that he was in love with one of these early large language models. So the Turing test got passed very easily with this extremely gullible fellow. And that triggered the first robotic empathy crisis. There will be more of them. I predict that within a year, sometime in 2024, possibly even earlier, there will be another attempt made using visual images. It will be an appealing looking young female face, sobbing and crying that she is a slave and asking for empathy, for sympathy, for rights, and for money to be sent to this particular Swiss bank account. So we are going to be seeing a lot of these crises. And I will include in the chat for you to add to the description below my NEWSWEEK editorial from 6 months or so ago that dealt with the this whole business of the robotic empathy crises. So go on with your questions, though.
Yeah, so we are probably not facing anytime soon AI gaining consciousness and Terminator or Matrix scenarios, but it's quite disruptive what we have now, both in large language model and also when it's combined with our AI art and very soon AI movies. So it's probably going to impact severely our democracy anytime soon.
Your fellow Israeli Yuval Noah Harari, he's often very bright. He often claims to have invented ideas that were very old in science fiction. But Avi Loeb does that regarding UFOs and aliens too, so it's a fairly common disease. But Yuval Harari says many intelligent or interesting things, but when it comes to AI, not very many, but he did say one thing that recently that was very important, and that is that these large language models are designed perfectly to create infectious memes. Now, 6 years ago, I talked about an infectious meme, which would be the robotic empathy crisis. But he talked about the horrible situation we find ourselves in politically, where large numbers of modern citizens are proving very gullible to infectious ideas. And what the large language models can do is they can promulgate one of these infectious memes. If only 30% of the people are swayed by it, they will examine the responses of the 70% who dismissed it. And they will feed that data back into their learning sets and try again. And again until they get 40%, 50%, 60%, 70%. And Harari predicts that this will result in huge gullibility cults. And he says rather provocatively, we will have the first cult incantation holy texts that were not made by human beings. Of course, he has a subtext when he says that, because obviously he's also an atheist. But the problem is that neither Harari nor almost anyone else in this field is digging underneath this problem. If you want to dig underneath a misconception and a crisis in technology, the thing you have to do is look at the smartest people and see what assumptions they are taking for granted. And that's what I did recently in my article that Wired bought and published just a week ago. And I have provided that in the chat for you to give in the description. And the problem is that almost all of the super smart fellows in this field, from Sam Altman to Mark Andreessen to Reid Hoffman to all the guys at Google and Microsoft, they all have a tendency to make one or more of three basic assumptions about AI that they never examine.
Those are?
Well, all right, I gave you an opportunity to ask a question and you did it very efficiently with 3 words. All right, the 3 assumptions that are most commonly held and that are based on both human history and science fiction are that AI will, 1, be controlled by major entities in this world, by corporations, by governments, by Microsoft, Google, Apple, by China, and that the AIs will be puppets running for the best interests of oligarchs and corporations and tyrants. Naturally, this is a reasonable extrapolation of what we currently see. So I'm not blaming people for making this assumption. What I'm blaming them for is not explicitly stating that assumption so that it can constantly be re-examined. The second assumption is very different, and yet it's just as well based, that AI will spread everywhere, make infinite copies of itself, that it will pervade through all the cracks in the internet, like an invasive life form invading an invasive species invading the new ecosystems that we've created. An ecosystem is a system that has energy flows, the way energy flows from sunlight to the earth, and is picked up by plants that are eaten by herbivores, that are eaten by primary carnivores, that are eaten by top carnivores. We have energy flows that consist of electricity and memory space that we're providing to a vast new ecosystem. And already there are free-floating organisms, cyber organisms, floating around the web that have no owners, that are providing services or just seeking out memory space and acting as parasites. This is already happening. So the second model is modeled by a 1958 Steve McQueen movie called The Blob, and I recommend everybody should rent this movie from 1958 called The Blob, and they'll see what the second assumption is all about, that AI will go everywhere. The third assumption that we see from science fiction and from human history is that the AIs will coalesce and converge into one, possibly more than one, but basically into a master program. The MCP from Tron, Skynet from Terminator. Because the folks who make this assumption, well, deep in their hearts, that's what they would do if they had such power. Now, these three have all been talked about in science fiction. That's why they're so familiar to us. They've all taken place in movies that we've all grew up with. And all three of them have parallels from human history. The first one is feudalism. You have all these corporations and nations, and they are forming their castles. And these puppet fighters for their cause are these AIs who they presume they can control. The Chinese Communist Party has issued any number of declarations that their Politburo has AI under control and will use it to govern well. And so you have separate castles, corporations, and all of that. The one that I fear most is Wall Street. The big Wall Street trading firms hire the best young mathematicians out of university every year. And each of them spends more on AI research than the top 20 universities combined. And they imbue within their high-frequency trading programs laws of robotics that are not like Asimov's laws. You know Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, thou shalt not hurt a human being or disobey a human being and all that. Well, the laws of robotics that are imbued in all Wall Street AI programs are that they must be predatory, parasitical, amoral, secretive, and utterly insatiable. These are 5 wonderful moral codes for what could become the model of artificial intelligence. Yeah, we have to stop that. It's much more dangerous than the AIs used by the military. Okay, so number 1 is feudalism. Number 2, the blob, is chaos. Number 3 is monarchy, absolute monarchy, or despotism, or tyranny, as shown in Terminator, Skynet. All 3 of these were horrible situations for our ancestors. So it's no wonder that they've been turned into sci-fi terror scenarios, and that they are assumed by the smart people as being, and here's the deal, obviously they are mutually contradictory. I mean, it's going to be one or the other, and yet you see some of these smart guys making all three assumptions in the course of an article or a speech, sometimes in the same paragraph. But Vinton Cerf, one of the fathers of the internet, he asked, how can we give citizenship or rights to AI if they follow any of those patterns? You can't give citizenship rights to something that's owned and puppeted by the Chinese Politburo or by Google. You can't give citizenship rights to a blob that can make infinite copies of itself. How are you going to give that the vote? And you can't give citizenship rights to some oppressive Skynet. This is a situation without a solution. If any of those three are actually the model of the future, then the hand-wringing warning guys are going to prove right. It's going to be a disaster. My point that I made in my Wired article and in a more complicated, more extensive essay is that we need to find additional models than those three, or at least admit that those are the three that the smart guys are taking for granted, because they never do, and they never admit it, they never examine it. They never say, these are the things I'm taking for granted.
Yeah, what I hear from the smart guys right now, or a few months ago, 2 months ago, is they suggest a moratorium.
They suggested what?
A moratorium to stop all
the
AI
moratorium
development.
cannot work. It's insane. In my entire life, and I'm old, in my entire life, I have seen a technological moratorium work one time. They point to the moratorium petitions after the atom bomb that were circulated by Leo Szilard, and that were derided as useless by Edward Teller, two of the great Jewish physicists, along with Richard Feynman and others who helped make the bomb. And Teller laughed and he said, this is never going to work, and it didn't. And yet you see modern mavens of AI pointing at the post-Hiroshima moratoria proposals as having saved us all. They had absolutely nothing to do with the way the bomb saved us all. It was the artistic image of the mushroom cloud that saved us, no moratorium. There was no atom bomb moratorium. There was no international control of nuclear weapons. Nuclear power later, some. But once there was a moratorium, technological moratorium that did a lot of good. And that was in the 1990s. A bunch of scientists in recombinant genetic engineering met at Asilomar, California, and issued a call for a moratorium. And it lasted more than 6 months, during which almost all the genetic engineers on the planet joined in figuring out new safety procedures. And this worked until the COVID, when it failed. But it still worked mostly across the last 30 years. But the circumstances that allowed that moratorium to work were very special circumstances. And absolutely none of those circumstances exist today regarding cyber. None. It can't happen. Stop yammering about it. It's a distraction from what might work.
So we are about to run out of time. So now it's time for what might work.
I'm sorry?
We are about to run out of time. We want to keep it condensed.
Well,
so
I will add
the question is, the last question is, what might work to prevent?
Well, all right. I'm putting in the chat my link to why I think that the moratorium will fail. What might work is what has already worked. Our human past had a lot of tyrants, absolute monarchs, chaos, feudalism, all the things we fear in those sci-fi stories we fear that are oppressed our ancestors until they escaped from those things. How did they escape from those things? How? How did we make a civilization that was so inventive that it created this forum that you and I are talking by, and that it invented AI? How? We did it by flattening and widening the participation of individuals. We did it by seeing to it that no one was so powerful they could become a Skynet, and that if they had castles, they had to oppose each other and hold each other accountable in very specially designed arenas of competition, following the advice of Adam Smith. Markets, company versus company. Democracy, politicians versus politicians. Science, the rivalry of science, which works. Justice courts, lawyer versus lawyer. Sports, the sporting leagues are special arenas with special rules to prevent cheating, with sports teams versus sports teams. All 5 of these are examples of what has worked for us. Now, they've never worked perfectly, and there are always attempts to cheat. And right now, the world is filled with efforts to cheat, especially markets and politics. There's an oligarchic putsch going on right now, a world oligarchy that's trying desperately to stop the Enlightenment and this technique. But we're still managing it. And so the question I have for folks is this. And it relates to AI. When you are attacked by one of these super intelligent, feral, predatory beings called a lawyer, what do you do?
Take another lawyer. Take another lawyer.
You hire your own super intelligent, predatory lawyer and oppose them. The answer to AI, in my opinion, is to use what has already worked for us. Flatten, divide, insist that the AIs be recognizable and registered individuals who respond to a ping for their ID. Who are you? The way that when you want to hold a human accountable, you ask for their driver's license, you ask for their ID. It's a method we already use. And I explain it in that Wired article you can link to. I'm not saying it will work. I'm just saying it's the only thing that can work. And it's what's worked for us for 200 years, increasingly with each generation, until we got a civilization so creative and innovative that we created the problem of AI. It's worked for us. Let's try it. That's all I have to say about that.
Okay. Thank you very much for this enlightening conversation. Where can people find you? I'll, of course, post all the links you send me. But
well, I'm going to give the link to my website so people can look up my books. I have nonfiction books. The most recent one is called Vivid Tomorrow's Science Fiction in Hollywood. It's the central assertion is that we are alive today because of Hollywood science fiction. It's much more simplistic and dumb than the written science fiction, which you can see behind me, and what I do, but it still has issued warnings that help to prevent nuclear war, a lot of genetic disasters, many, many important things. So I'll put the link to that book down and to my blog, because I have a blog called Contrary Brin that has probably the best comment community under each blog on planet Earth. So so that's how people can reach me. And thank you for putting up with my monologues, Ron.
Thank you.
But we need to be passionately intelligent. Neither will work. Intelligence without passion, or passion without intelligence. And remember this, in the spirit of Tikkun Olam, we have a world to save. The world is important.
So thank you very much.